Good morning or good afternoon, class. Mr. Long here with another video lecture as a continuation of the French Revolution and actually what occurs once we get into the French Revolution when it does break out. So what we are going to do is we're going to do a very, very quick review of what we've learned so far. And then from there, we're going to get into our new material or new content or information. So same rules apply. Remember, I always add more to the video lectures than what you just see on the screen. So do me a huge favor. Please just listen to the video lecture, and then right when I'm about to go to the next slide and move on, hit pause and then do your fill in the blanks. Don't try to listen and do the fill in the blanks as I'm doing the video lecture. It's just better to listen and then pause and then write out your notes. So just a quick review. Major reasons why the French Revolution breaks out. There's a lot of stuff going on in France at the time. Most important, remember, the Enlightenment was a time period that actually starts in France and it circulates through France, then Europe, then North America, and different parts of the world. But the Enlightenment time period really focuses on reason and thinking and making decisions on your own and really not having to rely on other people to make decisions for you. With that being said, all these different Enlightenment thinkers or philosophers also have the ideas of rights and freedoms for people. So once these books are being published about the Enlightenment, it starts to spread very, very quickly throughout not only France, but the rest of Europe. So the Enlightenment ideas really played a huge part in the breakout of the French Revolution, just like it did previous years with the American Revolution. So the French really looked at what happened here in North America when the colonists fought against the British, and they were influenced by that. The second point is economic problems. We should know that there's huge debt that is occurring in France at this time because France has fought in several wars. And of course, wars are expensive. They cost lots of money. And also, the king and queen are overspending. They are very young when they become king and queen. They're only 19 and 18 years old when they actually take the throne. They're very inexperienced, and really, they like to spend money on themselves. So France goes into a huge debt. I also mentioned in the previous video lecture, there is major food shortages. There's a big drought, and then after the drought, there's huge floods that go all throughout the countryside, and that absolutely destroys the crops in France. So the food that is produced, or the crops that are produced, there's not much of it, and the ones that they, or the food that they do sell, the crops that they do sell, they're going to sell at a very high price. There's going to be very little supply, and there's going to be a high demand of food. People start starving. There's no food, and the food that they do have is very expensive. So that becomes a huge problem. The third point I mentioned in the previous one, but just weak leadership. Marie Antoinette, who was the queen, and then King Louis the 16th, who's king of France at the time, they are very inexperienced. And I've already mentioned they're very young. They really only care about themselves. They don't take into account too much of what is going on with their citizens and all the problems going on in their country. So that becomes a big problem. We mentioned also in the previous video lecture the breakdown of the old regime. Now, we should all remember what the old regime was, the first, second, and third estate. Well, the third estate, which is made up of the bourgeoisie, the city workers, and the peasants, they become very fed up. And at one point, the first and second estate, they have a meeting, and they lock out the third estate. And they have this meeting in an indoor tennis court. And this event is known as the tennis court oath. And the third estate actually break down the door, and they refuse to leave until they create a new constitution, a new government. So what ends up happening is that the third estate breaks away from the old regime, and they create a brand new government that is known as the National Assembly. And I mentioned the tennis court oath already. but a couple other events, and these events you guys took care of with your summaries from last week. But the storming of the Bastille, remember what the Bastille was? It was an old French prison. And the French citizens broke into this prison looking for gunpowder to arm themselves against the French army, people attacking them. The Great Fear was another important event that led to the revolution, where this happened and occurred in the countryside. Peasants were scared that nobles were hiring outlaws to go after them. So it created a huge, huge panic throughout the countryside. The March to Versailles, remember, the king, queen, and the royal family lived in the Versailles Palace. And as a result of the food shortages and the rising prices of bread, women specifically started rioting. And they actually broke into the palace. And they were looking for the royal family. And the royal family actually left and they escaped. And them leaving Versailles really marked the beginning of the revolution. So these are just a few events that occurred. Just a quick review. Once again, hit pause, go ahead and fill in all the blanks that you need to, and then we'll go ahead and move on. Okay, so after the Third Estate breaks off from the old regime, they form the new government that is known as the National Assembly. Now, just like here in the United States, they need to create a document that goes with their government. And that's exactly what the French did. The National Assembly is going to create the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which sounds a whole lot like the Declaration of Independence, which was written, of course, by Thomas Jefferson here in the United States before it was the United States. And of course, the French are going to be very influenced by Jefferson. They're going to be very influenced by John Locke because remember, Jefferson got all of his ideas from John Locke. So this played a big, big role in what was stated in that very, very important document. Just a quick quote, men are born and remain free and equal in rights, once again, coming from John Locke. These rights include liberty, property, and security, and the resistance from oppression. So this should all sound very, very familiar because we did talk about this with the Enlightenment. We also did talk about this with the American Revolution. Once again, Enlightenment plays a big, big role and influence on the French Revolution breaking out. And unfortunately for women, the Declarations of Rights of Man and Citizen, women are not included. This just gives right to men and men only. It won't be till later on where women will have the right to vote and have a say in government. So go ahead and hit pause and fill in all the blanks for this section. Now, guys, if you should already notice after each section, you will have 3 lines that is dedicated to summarizing the information in that section. So what I really want you to do is I want you to hit pause, and then I want you to make sure you're filling in all the correct blanks, and then take about 2 or 3 minutes, read through that information, and then I want you to give me a summary in 30 words or less, maximum 2 sentences. So you just tell me what is happening in that section of notes that you just filled in. So moving on now, we got to talk about the church a little bit. And hopefully we all remember that the church, if we're talking about the old regime, belonged to the First Estate. You also call them clergy members or church officials. Now remember, the church officials or the clergy members, they made up about 1% of the total population of people living in France at the time, which was only about 260,000 people that made up the First Estate because there was 26 million people living in France. But remember, the church really didn't have to pay any taxes. They donated about 2% of their annual income, and they used that almost, I guess you can say, as a tax, but if you think about it, 2% is close to nothing. So the early reforms by the National Assembly is really, really going to focus on the church. They're going to take a lot of power and a lot of land away from the church. And they're going to take land specifically away from the church for one reason. They need to pay off the huge debt that France has accumulated. And they don't want to raise taxes on people because that's what really got them in trouble in the first place, is that the Third Estate was paying all the taxes for the country, and that eventually led to the revolution breaking out. So the National Assembly, which is once again the new government in France, did not want to raise taxes, so they needed to figure out a way to pay off the national debt. So they took land away from the church, they sold that land, and they used the money from the sales of the land to pay off some of their debt. The clergy or church officials are now state officials. They are employed by the government, and the government pays them, and they also have to be elected to get that job. No longer will they be appointed, but they will be elected. And that's very, very important. And that's a key point in democracy, is when you as citizens actually elect and allow people to vote to elect their leaders. So that's a really important point for all of us to understand. I've already mentioned that the church is going to lose most of their power and independence. They're not going to have any power anymore because they're now state officials. The government tells them what to do. And they're not an independent person anymore. There's no longer the old regime anymore. They no longer have this power, this money anymore. And they're basically being told what to do by the government, the new government, known as the National Assembly. Unfortunately, though, the treatment of the church really upset people, especially the peasants. The peasants were devout Catholics. When I say devout, that means like they're devoted. They take their religion very seriously. And they did not like the way that the government, the new government, the National Assembly, was treating the church, which is kind of ironic because if you think about it, the peasants were the ones that were being treated the worst under the old regime. So you would think that they would want a little more equality, a little more fairness. But once again, peasants did not like the way the church was being treated. Go ahead, hit pause once again, fill in the blanks, and then give me the 30-word or less summary for this section. Now, moving on to King Louis the 16th. I've already mentioned a couple things about Louis the 16th. He's very weak. He's very inexperienced. He takes over the throne when he's only 19 years old. He marries Marie Antoinette when they are 15 years old and 14 years old. She's 18 when she becomes queen. They're very young. They're inexperienced. They don't know how to run a country. So I've already mentioned before that the rioting in Versailles resulted in the royal family fleeing and trying to get away. But they're going to be caught, and they're going to be caught at the Austrian border. And what ends up happening is that they're later going to be put on trial, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So on September 1791, the National Assembly is going to write a new constitution. And hopefully we remember by now, that a constitution is a document. And it's just like a long list of rules and laws that people must follow for that country. So France writes a brand new constitution. And this is going to force Louis XVI to sign the Constitution, even though he doesn't want to, because he knows the second he signs this new Constitution, he will lose most of his power as king. He is no longer going to be an absolute monarchy. Now remember what an absolute monarchy is. Those are kings or queens who do whatever they want, and there's no consequence for their actions. So there's going to be a transition from an absolute monarchy to a limited constitutional monarchy, meaning Louis XVI really has no more power, and he's limited to the same rules and laws of the citizens of France. And this has never applied to him before. So this is going to be a huge, huge change. He does have power. I know I mentioned it takes all of his power away, but he still has the power to enforce the laws. But you got to remember that the laws are not going to be created solely by him. They're going to be created by, people in France. So he enforces the law. That's the one power that he still has. And what the National Assembly ends up doing, and remember, I keep on saying National Assembly. The National Assembly replaces the old regime. It's the new government of France. And the National Assembly is going to create a branch, a new type of government under the National Assembly, and that's going to be called the Legislative Assembly. And hopefully we remember what the legislative branch here in the United States does. The legislative branch is our Congress, and it makes laws for us, and it can also declare war on other countries. And that's exactly what the Legislative Assembly does for the country of France. They create laws, and they approve or reject declarations of war by France. So go ahead, hit pause, fill in the blanks for that section, and once again, please write down your 30-word or less summary for that section. Okay, so now we really need to focus on this new part of the National Assembly, which is the Legislative Assembly, which is like our Congress here in the U.S. Now, food shortages are still a big, big problem. All these problems that I've mentioned last week and even some of the review today, those problems just don't disappear when a new government takes over. Those problems are still there, but the new government needs to figure out a way to solve those problems. So once again, food shortages are huge, huge problems in France at this time. And the major problem with the Legislative Assembly is not everyone's going to agree. It's just like our Congress. You have a big group of people, and their job is to make rules and laws, but they're not always going to have the same opinions on certain things. And there's going to be a lot of conflict. So what ends up happening is that there's going to be a major split with the Legislative Assembly. You're going to have three groups of people. You're going to have the radicals, you're going to have the moderates, and you're going to have the conservatives. Now let's start off with the radicals first. Radicals are exactly what they sound like. They want extreme change, and they are going to oppose any sort of idea of a monarchy whatsoever. They want more of a democracy. They want nothing that resembles a monarchy at all. So the radicals want the absolute most change in the Legislative Assembly. Then you're going to have the moderates, and the moderates, they want some change, but they're not as extreme as the radicals. And then finally, you have the conservatives. And the conservatives like the idea of a monarchy, a limited constitutional monarchy. And they like that idea, but they don't want major changes in France. So they like the idea that a king or queen has to follow a set of rules and laws, but they don't want big changes occurring in France. So you have these three groups of people that belong to the Legislative Assembly, and these three groups of people, remember, their main job is to make rules and laws for the country of France. So that becomes very, very difficult when they have opposing opinions and viewpoints. So once again, hit pause, make sure you fill in all of the blanks for that section, and then please write down your 30-word or less summary. So moving on, so when all this is occurring in France, all the countries that surround and border France kind of start to freak out. They freak out because some of those countries are also absolute monarchs. And if it could happen in France, what makes you think it can't happen in other countries, especially the countries that are really close to France? So all of the bordering countries become very fearful that the revolution is going to spread into France, spread into these other countries, and it's going to create problems in those countries also. So what ends up happening is Austria and Prussia are asking, a polite way, I guess we can say at first, to France, you need to restore Louis XVI as an absolute monarch. Okay, because remember, he's a limited constitutional monarch at this point. Louis has to listen to rules and laws that all the citizens of France have to listen to. So Austria and Prussia go to France, the National Assembly, the new government, say, you need to restore Louis XVI as an absolute monarch. Well, of course, the new government is not going to agree to that. They don't want Louis XVI as an absolute monarchy anymore. They want something that resembles the furthest away from a monarchy. So one of the jobs besides making rules and laws for the country by the Legislative Assembly is that the Legislative Assembly can also declare war. And that's exactly what France does. They declare war on those two countries of Austria and Prussia. At this point, Prussia invades France and they close in very, very close to Paris, which is a big issue. 20,000 men and women are going to invade the royal palace, massacring royal guards and imprisoning the royal family. So at this point, when this is all happening, you have the citizens of France and they actually break into the royal palace and they imprison and capture the royal family. They don't want Louis XVI to become an absolute monarch, and they're going to make sure that that does not happen. So from there, once again, hit pause, fill in all the blanks, and please write down your 30-word or less summary. Okay, our last section is known as the National Convention. So as things begin to spin out of control in France, so not only is France experiencing this revolution within their own country, it's almost like a civil war, they're fighting against each other, but they're also at war with their neighboring countries. So as things just are chaotic, they're out of control at this point, the Legislative Assembly, they set aside the Constitution that they just created, and they dispose the king. Now, when you dispose of something, like you dispose the trash, that means you get rid of it. You throw it away. So they no longer look at Louis XVI as being a king at all. He's not even a limited constitutional monarch anymore. He has zero ties to the royal family because he's not a king. They don't look at him as a king. And the Legislative Assembly also dissolves the new government of the National Assembly. So now there is no longer the old regime. There is no longer the National Assembly. And what they do is they create another government that is known as the National Convention. And the National Convention replaces the National Assembly and the Legislative Assembly. Right off the bat, okay, the National Convention abolishes the monarchy. No longer look at Louis, no longer look at Marie Antoinette as king and queen. There is no longer a monarchy at all in France. They actually declare France a republic. And a republic, hopefully we know, is a form of democracy. And democracy means we, us, the citizens, the people, actually have all the power in the government because we are the ones that will elect the leaders to make decisions for us in government. At this point, under the National Convention, only adult male citizens could vote and hold public office. And that is all. No one else. Unfortunately, females, women, you still don't have the right to vote. So from there, go ahead, and that's going to conclude our video lecture for today. Please pause it, fill in all the blanks, write down your very last 30-word or less summary for this section. At any point, if you need to go back and re-listen to the video lecture, please do so. And that is all.